The great man theory is an idea that history moves along due to the actions of singular great individuals. Great in this term means active and vibrant. Such people could be good or evil. The polar opposite of this theory is people's theory, where history is moved along by the masses of the people. There is another theory known as elite history, the belief that history is driven by select groups of rich and powerful. Some of these are called the establishment. Take a wild guess which one I tend to lean into. Okay. I actually believe there's actually a combination of the three. I don't believe that you can completely exclude them. However, typically some elements are far bigger drivers than others. Misunderstanding the mechanisms can lead you to bad answers. Now, people's theory, in my opinion, is probably the least important driver. This theory itself points to the idea that subtle shifts in what people do build momentum to create the great events of history. The first problem of this idea is subtle movements. This infers that it's hard to measure it, and what can't be measured, well, really can't be seen, doesn't make the best of a theory. The mythology of the French Revolution is very seductive to the people's theory crowd. If you bought purely into people's theory, you'd say the people of France rose and then triggered the events known as the French Revolution. However, with a little bit of study, it's easy to see that virtually every event of the French Revolution, at least up until the Terror, was astroturfed by establishment factions. And we'll revisit this in a future video. Now, great man theory itself can lead you into a lot of wrong conclusions. Now, remember, great in this usage doesn't mean good. It means an individual actor who drove history in a major way for good or ill. So, if a Hitler or a Bonaparte or a Caesar can completely change the course of a country, why can't a similar National Socialist or dictator do the same thing here? Well, the answer is the establishment is a limiting factor on how far a great man can go. A Hitlerian figure could no more take control of America than a Gandhi-esque figure could. The American Revolution is a great starting place. It showcases people's theory, elite history, and great man happening synergistically. Now, from the 1600s, continuing through the opening shots of the Revolution, there were a series of frontier revolts in the West against the Eastern establishment. Nearly every colony had at least one major uprising. These revolts had no ability to make headway, with the exception of maybe Bacon's Rebellion, because they did sack and burn the capital at the time. However, they were never able to take over or completely alter the outcome of how things ran in their respective colonies. Pretty much the majority of them, again, uh, not counting Bacon, avoided tangling directly with the colonial armies that were sent against them. So, leading up to the events of the Revolution, the establishment, which had held solid up until that point, which is why the Western rebellions could never make headway, this establishment that had held so well split into three factions. There was the independence faction, and this group harnessed and organized the anger of the Western citizens and used media to agitate the Eastern population and generate enough friction that created an opening for the great man of this saga, George Washington. Now, the other two factions were the Unionists, who essentially wanted to create um, essentially an American parliament that would look exactly like the English and Scottish parliaments, that would answer directly to the king. So the idea would be is we would create a centralized government that was run by a colonial parliament of Americans that answered directly to the king. The exact same way the English Parliament did. So it would move us out from under the English Parliament, under our own Parliament and the king. The other faction, of course, were the Loyalists. Now, if we go back to our great man, George Washington, uh, if let's say and he'd exist in this time, let's say none of those elements come together with the establishment, where you have this breaking of the establishment that leads to a revolution. Well, George Washington, great man as he was, would not have started a revolution all on his own. It would have been not much of a thing at all. Without a revolution, there's a good chance that Washington would have been pining away for a commission in the English army, which he had been looking for up until just before the American Revolution. So without those elite elements of the history, Washington becomes a historical footnote. And what happens if Washington is unavailable? Is there anyone else who could have filled his role? Maybe, but it's questionable if such a person would have brought things forward as much as George did. So we get to see that Washington, what the elite started, could not be completed without Washington. However, Washington has no place until the elites create it for him. And probably there's no other figure who could step up and fill the spot. And it just occurred to me that the one person who might have been able to, uh, Benedict Arnold, which would mean he probably would have never revolted. He probably had the military acumen and the gut vigor to basically carry the war to its conclusion. But I can't really think of many else. Though somebody else was in that role, the revolution may have not nearly as been as successful, and I would suspect it wouldn't have been. Now, I'm a huge fan of George Washington, and he's credited as taking the limited role of president when the potential for him to become dictator was open to him. Now, I think Washington was a good man in that he would not have taken the dictator role against the wishes of his countrymen. However, the role that was eventually created for him was created by the establishment, that of being president. Now, Washington was keenly aware of the sensibilities expected of a disinterested man. I mean, he worried constantly how his peers in the establishment viewed him. Now, if the establishment had wanted him to be a dictator, he probably would have taken up the mantle. I think he would have been a very kind and benevolent dictator. However, the American Revolution is the story of elite history using a populist movement, i.e., people, and making a big opening for a great man, who is Washington. Um, and as we go along, this is kind of going to be a series hitting critical historical events uh, from the Revolution kind of up to current. Uh, I'm not going to call them multi-part, because what happens is YouTube suppresses anything that it thinks is a multi-part video. It thinks you're loading the same thing over and over again, even though it's completely different material. And one of the things I kind of want to hit home eventually is the idea that I know a lot of people get freaked out about Trump going, well, he's going to end up being Mr. H again. Well, I don't think it's possible. Not necessarily because he has no such desire, but because there isn't a place for such a figure in our establishment. And as I drive this series along, hopefully this idea will make more sense to you. And then in the end, we'll talk about him directly and where he fits in things. All right, in the comments below, what do you think? Was there somebody out there who could have filled Washington's shoes if Washington had been available? Do you think Washington could have driven a revolution by himself, or did he actually need the elite establishment, as I said? Uh, you see a bigger role for the people than I have laid out here? If so, throw them in the comments. Tell me what you think. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please take a look at my other titles. There's lots of stuff. You're going to find something you like. You should subscribe. And of course, if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.